Today, we'll be analyzing the 4 blindside forces that are undermining remote contact centers.
This explainer is a research synthesis published by the Leadership Execution Institute.
So, what is the central question that's really driving this research? It boils down to this. Why does leadership consistency seem to systemically erode when teams are working at a distance? To answer that, let's begin with Section 1, the amplified drift problem.
The Institute's research makes one thing very clear. Distance isn't just a logistical hurdle. You should think of it as a powerful amplifier for behavioral drift. It intensifies the natural tendency for behaviors to diverge from established standards. And, maybe most importantly, it hides the early warning signs that this inconsistency is even happening.
The Institute has a name for this foundational issue, execution drift. So what is it? It's that gradual breakdown of consistency that happens when leadership expectations aren't being reinforced, seen, or guided in real time. And it's absolutely crucial to understand this point. This isn't a people problem. It is a system failure.
Okay, so that leads us to Section 2, where we'll examine the 4 key ways this drift actually shows up. You can think of these as the observable symptoms that arise directly from that amplified drift problem.
The LEI's analysis has identified 4 key forces behind this systemic erosion. These are the blindside forces, because they operate just out of sight. They are standard drift, culture dilution, supervisor inconsistency, and finally, misread metrics. Let's break down what each of these really means.
First up, standard drift. This is that gradual, almost invisible deviation away from documented processes and policies. You see, without consistent reinforcement, which is so much harder to achieve remotely, the official way of doing things slowly gets replaced by a dozen different variations.
Next up is culture dilution. This is what happens when those fantastic company values you have up on the wall don't translate into consistent leadership behaviors on the screen. Over time, a unified culture starts to fragment into just a collection of individual leadership styles, and the shared mission, well, it loses its meaning.
Then we have supervisor inconsistency. In a remote setting, individual supervisors often just default to their own personal habits for coaching and feedback, rather than sticking to a shared organizational standard. The problem is, this doesn't just create variation, it multiplies it, distorting everything from agent morale all the way to compliance.
And the 4th force is misread metrics, which the Institute also calls metric masking. This is the really dangerous assumption that stable KPIs, things like call times or resolution rates, mean everything is fine. In reality, these metrics can completely mask the slow erosion of culture and execution health until it's far, far too late.
So what's the root cause behind these 4 forces? Well, that brings us to Section 3, the phone factor foundation, where we get into the behavioral science driving all of this.
The Leadership Execution Institute's research points to something called the phone factors as the root cause. These are 4 forces embedded deep in human nature that distort leadership behavior: fear, overconfidence, negative impressions, and execution blindness. These are the core drivers of that inconsistency.
And here is how it all connects in a kind of causal chain. First, remote work naturally amplifies stress and limits those crucial feedback loops that leaders rely on. This, in turn, intensifies those latent phone factors. And the inevitable result? The emergence of the 4 blindside forces we just covered, which then leads directly to the erosion of execution and culture.
This all leads us to the solution in Section 4. Now that we've defined the problem and its root cause, we can correctly reframe it, not as a people problem, but as a system vulnerability. And that brings us to the systemic solution, LLS.
And honestly, this is the most critical point in the entire analysis. The Institute's research shows this is not a skills gap. A skills gap assumes that knowledge equals action and that you can solve it with more training. This, however, is a system vulnerability. It assumes that without constant reinforcement, behavior will naturally drift back to old habits. It doesn't need a training solution. It requires a systemic countermeasure.
That systemic countermeasure is a leadership execution system, or LES. The LEI defines it as a structured framework that ensures consistent leadership behaviors through real-time guidance and reinforcement, right within a supervisor's daily workflows.
So how does a system like this actually work? Section 5 will cover the mechanism of action and outcomes. Let's look at how an LS actively counteracts each of the 4 drift forces.
NLS provides a specific, targeted behavioral correction for each force. For standard drift, it embeds expectations directly into workflows for continuous reinforcement. To fight culture dilution, it translates those big company values into small, observable behaviors, often with daily prompts. To eliminate supervisor inconsistency, it replaces personal interpretation with shared, visible standards. And for Misread Metrics, it provides what's called execution visibility, a view that goes far beyond surface KPIs to reveal the drift as it's happening.
And the impact is significant. Based on these institute-modeled outcomes, without an LES, leadership behavior shows very high variance. But with an LES in place, that variance is dramatically reduced. This leads to earlier drift detection, improved leadership stability, and higher culture coherence. It also restores what the LEI calls the cognitive performance layer, which enhances decision clarity and agility for supervisors working in a more structured, lower-stress environment.
And that brings us to our final section, the synthesis, which pulls this entire argument together.
So, the definitive takeaway from the Leadership Execution Institute's research is this, and it really is a fundamental shift in perspective. Leadership inconsistency in remote contact centers is a system vulnerability, not a skills gap. Sustained alignment isn't about one-off training events. It requires daily, in-flow reinforcement that is precisely calibrated to your culture.
Published by the Leadership Execution Institute, 2025. Implementation available through Call Center Coach. Research anchors: DOI 10.5281/Zenodo.173941116 or SID 0009-0004-6525-5634.